Welcome to the History of New Orleans and Chicago Jazz by Andrew Yohe. Let's get started. Before we talk about Chicago and New Orleans jazz, let us first look at and define what jazz is. Jazz is the style of music that is defined and well known for fast tempos, syncopated and complex rhythms, improvisation, and personalization. This style of music developed in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. It gained much of its popularity and influence from African American origins, and many of the rhythms and tempos introduced in jazz music can be tied back to African American songs and culture. Now that we understand what jazz is, let us look at where jazz all began. The origins of jazz largely came from New Orleans, Louisiana, and it all started in the late 1800s. After the Civil War ended, many instruments were just left alone, and many new musicians, particularly black musicians, began playing them in their own style and creating a new type of music which would later become jazz. This style of music quickly became popular in places like New Orleans, where large African American populations were present. Therefore, New Orleans quickly became the center for the birth of jazz. Jazz became popular and was born in New Orleans for several reasons. First, as previously stated, there is a large African American population in New Orleans at this time, and many of the new musicians of jazz were African American, and thus there was a large amount of musicians in New Orleans. Secondly, there was plenty of opportunities for these new musicians to play their music and to introduce their craft. In New Orleans, as many know, there's lots of parties, events, and Mardi Gras especially, in which these new musicians, these jazz musicians, were able to practice their skills. One important topic to discuss when understanding New Orleans jazz is Storyville. Storyville was a red light district of New Orleans, which was associated with a lot of gambling and dance halls, and, well, some pretty bad stuff happened there, and a lot of illegal stuff. However, this shady area of town quickly became popular and helped spark the birth of jazz. Many of these gambling halls and dance halls needed musicians to play in them, and who better to play were these new style of musicians, and thus the need was there, and there was plenty of musicians to go around. So, this somewhat questionable part of New Orleans history was actually a great thing in terms of jazz, because it helped boost the careers of many musicians, as we see earlier, and help make jazz what it is today. Let us now talk about jazz bands. New Orleans jazz bands typically consisted of 3 to 8 members, with instruments including a clarinet, a trumpet, a trombone, a banjo, a tuba, and a set of drums. These jazz bands, which were very new, were usually a mix of trained and untrained musicians who entertained at various parties and gatherings, as we discussed earlier. There was large amounts of these bands, especially in New Orleans, and therefore there was plenty of variations and types of jazz music during this time. Let's now take a look at the leaders of New Orleans jazz. Let's start with Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong is arguably the most well-known jazz musician of all time. He was originally born and raised in New Orleans, so much of his influence in his entire life came from the atmosphere of New Orleans. He is known for original and beautiful expressive jazz songs, as well as insane trumpet techniques that were completely new and original to anyone who was listening. Louis Armstrong was essential in paving the way in New Orleans jazz, and many believe that jazz would not have become what it is today without Louis Armstrong. Another member and leader of jazz in New Orleans was Ferdinand Lamoth, better well known as Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton grew up playing ragtime piano in brothels in Storyville as a teenager. Thus, as we explained earlier, Storyville was essential in launching the careers of many jazz musicians and helped pave the way in the jazz music industry. Jelly Roll Morton was most well known for his piano composing and arranging, and many of these can still be heard today through recording. These two men, although very different in their techniques and their style of music, were both influential and paved the way into jazz as we know it today. Jazz was born in New Orleans and continued to flourish there until about the 1920s. In the 1920s, Prohibition struck in America, and officials struck down the Storyville district and many of the red light districts in New Orleans. However, these areas, as we talked about earlier, were very popular with jazz artists, and thus many of the artists and musicians were out of work. Thus, because of Prohibition and the shutdown of many of its popular areas, New Orleans musicians began to turn their eyes to different places to practice their craft. One of these places that we will next talk about is Chicago. Now that many of the musicians from New Orleans jazz began to turn their eyes to different atmospheres, a new style of jazz was born. This jazz was known as Chicago jazz, which obviously stemmed from it being in Chicago. Chicago, with a thriving population and a thriving economy, plus with a center of performing and recording music, it became a very obvious choice to become the new home of jazz. However, the style of music adopted in Chicago jazz was very different from what it was in New Orleans. First off, instead of largely being directed and controlled by black musicians, Chicago jazz was largely led by white musicians. Many of these white musicians sought to copy and also to replicate and praise the old New Orleans style of jazz. Many called this white imitation of the New Orleans jazz as Dixieland jazz. And as you'll see, Dixieland jazz both differed and was also very similar to the styles that was developed and were born in New Orleans. Let us now take a look on how Dixieland jazz differed from the New Orleans style of jazz that we previously discussed. As said in the previous slide, Dixieland jazz was led by more white musicians and bands, rather than New Orleans jazz, which was influenced by a large African American population. Dixieland jazz also included the use of a saxophone and replaced the banjo that New Orleans jazz used with a guitar. Chicago jazz, or Dixieland jazz, was characterized by a big city energy with more complex improvisation. Jazz only remained popular in Chicago for about 10 years, until the end of the Roaring Twenties. This time the heart of jazz shifted to Kansas City. However, the influence of Chicago jazz can never be diminished. Styles of jazz like Dixieland jazz help make jazz the way it is today. In conclusion, both New Orleans and Chicago jazz have influenced modern jazz heavily as we know it today. It all began in New Orleans, and New Orleans. Thank you guys for watching this video, and hopefully